Well, this is a podcast that I have been looking forward to. I'm here with Kristin Bennion. She is a certified sex therapist, but it's kind of funny because we've known each other. I mean, I think we met on that singles cruise back in like 2009.
Oh, like 10 years ago, almost. Yes.
Yeah, that was fun though. It was basically 200 single Mormon people running around a cruise ship with nowhere to go for a week, and it was a good time. I mean, it was those were some of my favorite moments.
Absolutely.
But I just look back now at how everybody's path has gone these different ways, and it's funny because I had no idea you were going to become a sex therapist. It's such a fascinating topic. And I reached out on my social media to get some feedback from people, what questions and things they'd want me to ask. And I've never had more people direct message me than when I said I was interviewing a sex therapist. So I think this is the reason I did this podcast. This is a needed topic. This is something, don't share this with your kids in lieu of giving them the birds and the bees talk or whatever. But one thing that I'm adamant about and passionate about in this stage of my life is helping people get rid of some of the shame and the expectation about what their life needs to be. And in Utah, unfortunately, there are some unhealthy views around sexuality.
Yep.
And so that's why I wanted to talk to you. And I know what the pulse of my listeners and my followers is because of those messages. But let's back it up. 2009, we met on the cruise ship.
My, how times have changed.
It's pretty funny. I just love where life goes. So what point, I mean, how does one start the journey to become a sex therapist, and when did you decide to go into that field?
Well, I decided officially in grad school when I was at grad school at BYU, and a little bit in my undergrad at BYU Hawaii, but I knew I wanted to work primarily with women's concerns back then. And so I started, as I was becoming more educated, more familiar with the diversity of experiences especially within Utah, it became very appealing to see what I could do to try to help make things better. And I mean, it was always easy for me to talk about it, which I'm sure back then I thought that was cool.
Did you have an upbringing where it was very comfortable to talk about sex in the house and things like that? Or why was it so much easier for you to talk about sexual issues where for so many people it's not?
I'm not sure. My parents did great. We didn't talk about it a lot, but I always felt like I could come talk to them and ask questions. I didn't do that a ton. But yeah, I think it was the culture at large that really kind of got my goat.
Gotcha. It was funny when I was preparing for the interview, I started thinking, I was like, when did I have the first sex talk with my parents? I'm like, oh, we never had one. They never brought it up. It was just like this thing we didn't talk about. And it wasn't like, I wouldn't say we were my family's pretty liberal for a, very LDS family growing up and everything. But it was, we just didn't talk about it. It was one of those things. None of my siblings ever, ended up getting pregnant or getting somebody pregnant. I have 5 older siblings and a little sister, but it was just something that just never came up.
Yep.
And that's really weird because if I'm not getting the lessons from my parents, who's teaching me about sex, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think that's kind of funny. I tell people when you talk about sex education with kiddos, not talking about it is a pretty strong message to your kids, right?
What is that? I mean, let's talk about that for a second. It's a good place to start is, and we'll backtrack into some more stuff, but sure. What is the proper way to talk to your kids about sex? And what is the message? Let's start with that if you don't talk about sex with your kids.
Well, the pitfall with not talking about it is you can't control what that message will be. It is a message. It's a type of education. But the parents who I'm sure absolutely love their kids and want them to grow up to have a full, vibrant life that would have to include, healthy sexuality. They can't control that. And so it's left up to friends, neighbors, internet, school to a degree, and those types of things. So I think not creating the narrative or helping the kiddos learn the narrative, just it's anything goes. And then what are they going to do?
Right. Well, and several of the people that reached out to me from that question, they actually said, hey, growing up, I had such a negative stigma around sexuality or sex in general, and it's caused problems, either people directly or people said, I know people that have come to me, where it really causes this problem or this issue in their marriage or their adult life where they have so much guilt around sex, even married couples. A lot of times that's a real thing. Absolutely. Do you see that a lot in your practice?
I absolutely do. I think a lot because I work a lot with either people who have been Mormon at one point or LDS at one point or have transitioned a bit away. I think that many of them talk to me about how they spent so many years in their childhood and adolescence, maybe even their 20s, knowing that or believing that they had some sort of their worth was attached to what they were or were not doing in the sexual realm. For girls or for women, often it's how marriageable are you, what you might look like. There's a lot of pressure to be someone that someone might want to marry. For men, it's that being able to go serve a mission, those types of things. And so on both sides, if we're talking stereotypically, there's a lot of pressure to maintain a certain level of behavioral requirements. And a lot of times those aren't possible to maintain. And so that can be very shameful, and they can take on, feelings that they're not worthy for love or belonging because of something they've done or something maybe they want to do.
Well, I think, to me, it's like my view now, like sex to me is very much like many things that done at the wrong time or done too early or done in the wrong way, obviously can be a very negative thing. But in and of itself, it's a very beautiful, happy, should be one of the best parts of your life. And so, I mean, I'm 37 now. I have so many friends that are, 10, 15 years into marriage. I have a lot of single friends. I have a wide range of friendships in my life, and they all have their different separate issues with sexuality. I kind of want to get to the different parts, but who comes to you mostly? Who comes to a sex therapist more? Like, what kind of people do you normally see?
I work with a lot of couples, a lot of people who are in both long-term marriages, and then also I have quite a few that are, I love working with, like, they're brand new married, maybe they're BYU students, and they're having some experience.
What issues do you see from, like, the different couples?
Oh, the vast majority who come, they're experiencing a desire discrepancy. So there's one partner who has a higher libido, the other has much lower. So that, you ask any sex therapist and they're going to say that's what we get the most calls for.
And so one of the spouses, well, probably both are unhappy, and there's issues going on one way or the other.
Yep.
And so they come see you. And so I'm going to start with that one.
Sure.
What do you tell a couple, or how does the process go to help those couples? Because I think that is a very common, I have so many friends that, I have friends that have gone years without sex in their marriage, right? So what's going on there, and how do you help the couples to get on the same page again?
Well, I have to start with figuring out what's going on, because there, for some, an issue that's not talked about enough that should be, is a lot of women experience pelvic pain during, like, penis vagina intercourse. And so if that's going on, then there's a different kind of treatment that we would go down. But the standard, like, just lower libido, higher libido, needing a bridge, we have got to start learning how to talk about sex and sexuality, desires, preferences, yucks and yums, like the things that they do.
Well, it's so true, because it's like, it's anything else you would do if you were going on a vacation with somebody. You'd be like, I want to do this, I don't want to do this, let's try this. And, like, some of them you'd be like, well, I didn't really want to go to the opera, but you know what, we are in New York and you're into the opera, whatever, let's go try the opera. And then you'd be like, hey, you know what, I actually didn't mind the opera there. Or you're like, oh, you know what? And then the other guy's like, hey, well, let's go to the Yankees game, like, I'm not really a sports guy, or a sports girl, but whatever, I'll do it for you. And then you're like, yeah, it wasn't bad. I actually enjoyed a lot of that, And I think if you would talk about anything else you were doing that way. But for whatever reason, I think when it comes to sex, people have this, like, they feel like they're underperforming. They feel like they're not going to be seen the right way, or why is it such a difficult thing even for married couples to talk about that way? I
think there are probably 10 reasons, but the main ones coming to my mind are, that I see in my practice. Again, I'm in Orem, Utah, so I have
and let's preface this with, like, sexuality in Utah has so many different issues than anywhere else in the world, and
that's so true.
We'll dive into those too. But.
Okay. A lot of times, and it is a stereotype for a reason, as much as I hate talking about the stereotype, a lot of times it is the wife that has the lower libido and the husband that has the higher. And a lot of times by the time they come to see someone like me, she has been acting out of a sense of duty so much, lots of times due to these messages of growing up that the girls to kind of manage and the male sexuality and give him things, and the language around it is not sexual health oriented at all. And so they might have experienced a ton of desire right before they got married. A lot of times that's because some of the rules we're keeping it a very erotically charged situation because you had to stop. You missed him. You were getting ready for him. You're being courted, right? And then they get married, and all of a sudden they have no idea how to say, maybe I don't, or they don't even know that they can say, intercourse doesn't sound super awesome, but how about this tonight? It's all or nothing. And then they get years into it being maybe a peck, jump to intercourse. You know, I'm being dramatic, but that's very much so what I hear.
Sure. What you're saying is the fun, the creativity, all those parts of it kind of go out of the way. Well, and so is some of the messages, because you touched on something there that I think was very important. You said that there's a lot of messages that women get. Like, are you talking about like if you dressed immodestly, you're walking pornography? Kind of some of those types of messages. Yeah, absolutely. That you know, whatever you do might cause him to do something, and you're then responsible. I mean, the culture at large has a whole bunch of those, thoughts that are pretty damaging. Instead of a conversation about shared responsibility, consent, all the things that are within the principles of sexual health. No, that makes so much sense. And so so you said there's a couple things that those couples can do. You want to create a bridge and open up the communication. If let's say there's a woman listening to this right now and her sex life is she's not satisfied. We'll just say that. How does she even open that conversation with the husband, or how does the husband open that conversation with the wife? Call it out. I think that if you can speak in a kind, gentle, firm, and honest way to your partner, just saying, like, this is an area that is not our strength yet, talking about it. Begin with being able to talk about it. And then obviously introduce some, like, make sure you have the right resources, the right information. There are excellent books out there that can teach What are a couple of those? So for women, it's Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are is the best we have so far. It was written in 2015. It's on the latest in female sexual science. She does a phenomenal job at describing just the differences that some women can experience, not as opposed to men's, but just kind of expands upon and includes. Guide to Getting It On is maybe the Bible That's a good one. Sexuality. Yeah. No, it's good. And who's awesome. The author of that one? Paul Joaquinez, I can't remember how to say his last name. Paul begins with a J. Yeah, just so people get the right one. Yes, you get the wrong one and it's all awesome. Of a sudden like, wait. I give that as a wedding present for something. Awesome. Yeah. No, but isn't that funny that it's almost like weird to give that as a wedding present? Yeah. Like, I mean, obviously. People expect it from me. Yeah, I was going to say, you're now the sex therapist, but like anybody else, like if I gave that book, they're like, the hell, dude? Right, like, like you pervert, right? Like that's what they would start thinking. But there's some crappy messages for sure. That's a horrible who want to talk about sex, right? Like he must be perverted. And what's funny is like I have so many friends, and that like when it's one-on-one or you're in little group settings that are safe, they really do want to talk about this. They want to talk about it with their spouses. They want to open these dialogues so that they can have better sex. Like I look at it this way, like. Where else in your life do two people come together that you have sometimes no experience, sometimes just very limited experience, and all of a sudden you're expected to just have this great come together of a sex life? That's not very much of a reality, especially when you have all these negative wiring or this, this cultural wiring in your head about like that it can be wrong and that it's bad. I mean, I remember growing up, it was like sex is bad, sex is wrong, and I think in the Utah culture, we'll call it, you get that message so confused because you're trying to feel like, well, am I bad then, right? I remember thinking as a kid, well, I'm having all these sexual thoughts. Am I bad? Am I what is wrong with me? And those start to compound over and over. When in reality, it was like such a predictable behavior. It was such a predictable you were a healthy sexual adolescent. Yeah, exactly. And so absolutely. I was going to say I completely agree with you. The thing that I've learned with working with so many couples in this realm is that just how damaging the implicit or explicit message of it's easy, you'll figure it out, just wait till you get married. That can be so damaging to couples because it's actually quite a complicated topic. I mean, we don't expect someone to be able to play a beautiful concerto, by having like two basic, maybe misinformed messages. Well, and if one of them did, the other one would be all like, wait, what the hell? Why is he so good at this? No kidding. Yeah, there you go. So it's like even that, like, no, it's so true. Well, and it's, how does one, I mean, let's say there's a couple that's engaged and, they're excited for, get married and everything. How do they go about learning and being able to talk about it openly where you don't have to feel like this shame behind talking openly to your partner about what's right, what's wrong? How do they open those dialogues?
Well, this is going to sound super therapist-y, but this is one of my favorite things to encourage people to do as soon as possible. I mean, even just beginning dating, like start practicing saying what you liked and what you didn't so much, or what you'd like to try differently next time. From the get-go, like, oh, I didn't really like that position so much. Can we try it this way next time? Or before we move on to that, can we possibly stay in this fun space for a little while longer?
How does one not get offended in those moments? Because I just as you say that, it's like if you feel like you're getting critiqued on your sex, right?
Yeah.
You'd be like super defensive. Like
Sure,
that's the natural place to go there. And so how do you just not be offended? Like how do you open up that?
You kind of anticipate that there might be some discomfort. And so I think that this should be something I say at the beginning of any type of conversation like this. Learning to become more comfortable with sexuality involves a crap ton of discomfort. And so we have to learn which types of discomfort are okay. There's I'm growing, this is something new. I kind of feel stupid because I've never tried this before. That's uncomfortable. That is okay. But if it's going against your core values, or you're feeling like your consent is being violated, that is the type of discomfort that needs to be called out, right? And so we become more sophisticated with listening to our own body cues. And I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did.
Yeah.
So essentially what I'm hearing is you want to have boundaries, but at the same time be open at the same time. So how do you make sure, like because I had more than one message in my Instagram messages that said essentially my partner only wants to do missionary position. Mm-hmm. They think that sex is literally just to procreate, along those lines.
Yeah.
So how do you help somebody? Because by the way, I mean, sexuality is so much more than just having sex, right? And there's so many different forms of sex that really should be at least understood, if not experimented with, especially in a healthy sexual marriage or a sexual relationship in general. So when is it okay to when is it crossing a boundary line to try something new, and when should the person abort?
Well, I think that's a tough situation, but I would still say I would encourage the person who is wanting to try other things to help their partner understand, that getting to know someone sexually, really understanding what they want, what they don't, is one of the most intimate things someone can ever do. It's worth the discomfort more often than not, having those conversations. It would also be really great to explore with, you said her, I think, what's making her uncomfortable by trying other things, because sometimes they have not asked themselves why. Why do I feel this is wrong?
It's a great question. Is it wiring? Or,
is it just uncomfortable? And I've been taught that any type of discomfort is bad.
Right. Or where do people pick these things up? There's an old story. A guy's married and they're cooking a ham in the oven, right? And the wife cuts off both ends of the ham and sticks it in the oven. And he's notices that she cut off a pretty good portion of the ham. And he asks, he's like, well, why did you cut off the two ends of the ham? She goes, I don't know. It's the way my mom always did it.
Exactly.
And then she goes to the grandma or the mom, and she's like, how come you do that? And she's like, well, that's just the way my mom always did it. So then they go to her mom and she's like, hey, just out of curiosity, we're all wondering, why do you cut off the two ends of the ham when you cook it? And she says, oh, I just had a small oven when I was younger, and so we didn't have enough space for the big ham. It's such a good example of sometimes we have these ideas, our parents teach us something, or we pick something up along the way from somebody that has no meaning to our lives, and it absolutely isn't the one and only way to do something. And so I think it's important, like you said, to talk about that. Well, I was going to say, along those lines too, with the communicating, I hired a relationship coach a few years ago. I wanted to undo some of my own cultural wiring that was unhealthy. And oh my gosh, everybody should do this, by the way. It's made my life so much happier and more fulfilling to not live with shame that absolutely should not have existed.
Absolutely.
And one of the things she said is when you're with a woman that you're, getting intimate with, or you're dating or whatever else, to straight up just ask her, how do you like it, or how do you want it tonight, or how do you want to have sex, or hey, what are you comfortable with? I was on a date 4, 5, 6 months ago. It was 4th or 5th date with this girl. And I just said, hey, what are you comfortable with tonight? And she was like, right where we are. I was like, perfect.
That's
and
great.
That was like,
That's great.
But it was like, she told me later, she's like, you're the only guy that has ever ever said that. And she like, you know, we're really good friends. And she was just like, no guy's ever like put me in a place where I felt so comfortable to just be like, no, this is good. And she goes, and I actually got to relax and just enjoy like that basic what we were doing, because it wasn't, I had no fear or pressure of like, you were going to try to do something else that I wasn't comfortable with.
And that applies single, new partner, long-term marriage, like that pressure that like, if we don't, you know, one of the really important principles that I talk about with anyone is taking the mindset from being goal-oriented, which is like, ends with the male orgasm, and you know, or both have to orgasm at the same time, or this is unrealistic things.
You just have any kind of expectation of what the experience needs to be.
Yep. And if it doesn't fit that criteria, then it was like we failed, or I'm bad, or da da da. So we want to move it from that to pleasure and connection oriented. And so once people become pleasure oriented, they can, you know, they don't have to go on to intercourse. Maybe they want to stay doing some other really fun things that are equally as pleasurable and connecting, you know, instead of all this all or nothing type of mentality.
Well, if you think about it, in a perfect situation, you're with one person once you're married for 40 or 50 years.
Yeah.
You better figure out some ways to keep that interesting,
Yes,
right?
yes.
There is nothing else in your life you would do the exact same or very similar for 40 to 50 years without having a level of boredom to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of people get in the mistake of thinking like, I want something else, so I must not love my wife, or I want something else, maybe I don't want to be in this marriage, whatever that might be, when in reality, it's human nature, the monotony of doing the same thing over and over. I mean, you've got to mix that up, right?
Absolutely. One of my favorite authors is Esther Perel. She talks about the you know, paradox of how love desires, you know, consistency, knowing each other inside and out. Desire requires mystery and novelty. And so in long-term relationships, that is a vital concept to understand, that it's okay to want to change things up. It is okay to try something that you may never want to do again if it's consensual, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But to just try new things, new toys, different type of lube, you know, certain things that can just really change things up.
What are some of the things that you've seen? And on that basis, before I ask you that question, I guess Tony Robbins talks about the 6 human needs, right? And the 2 first ones are certainty and variety. He says we all need a certain level of certainty in our lives to feel like, I have to know this roof ain't going to cave in, or I'm going to be uncomfortable in your house. I have to know the house ain't going to slide off the mountain here. I have to know that you're not going to attack me. Like, you know, there's things that give us certainty, but then at the same time, if we don't have the variety, then that's like the energy of life. There's no, it just complete boredom. So, you know, I'm a adrenaline junkie. Like I'm a variety junkie. I want to go to every country is like my big goal. I'm always all over the place. So I probably overdo the variety side, but I don't get bored ever.
No, you don't.
You know? So it's like, so I think that's an important aspect of it though, is like, you're not wrong, or something's not wrong with your partner just because maybe you're a little bored. You probably just need to have some more variety in life.
Exactly. And that kind of comes back to one of the things we were talking about before with getting used to, you know, embracing certain types of discomfort. Because some people don't, it makes them uncomfortable to change things up, like especially with something as intimate and vulnerable as sexual intimacy with another person. And so getting used to the, you know, it's okay to not know really where we're going as long as the principles of consent are there. Invite that uncertainty, invite that, you know, thing that you may not have done last week, but want to try out this week type of thing. And then that's the erotic charge that can really be there.
Well, and it's Tony Robbins also, I hate to use him example, but I think he is an expert on helping couples like find more passion. That's what his whole thing is. He says all the passion is found from polarity. And that's not, so polarity gets confused. We all have masculine and feminine energy in us.
Yep.
But the more polarized those 2 energies can be from the 2 people, the better off you're going to be. So the more the man can be in his masculine, or the woman in the man, you know, the woman can be in her feminine, the more you're going to have passion in a relationship. So if you feel like you don't have passion in the moment in your relationship, what's going on a lot of times is one of you is either come more to the middle. So let's say the mom or the wife has to take on some of the roles that she didn't necessarily want to. All of a sudden, she's become much more of a boss around the house in the sense that she didn't want to, right? Or the guy starts doing, he unfortunately lets himself get demasculated a little bit. The wife's nagging him and he's just like, fine, whatever. He's getting kicked around the house a little bit, right? By the way, there's a really good video, Tony Robbins, I'm Not Your Guru on Netflix, where there's a part where he talks about this. Yeah. And he takes a guy, this is just a real life example, so it's the best way to show it. But he takes a guy and a woman and he says, describe your passionate love relationship life, right? And the woman gets up and she is just lit up, and she's beautiful feminine woman, and she's talking about like this orgasmic experience in life and all these things she wants. And then the guy gets up and he's like disheveled, and he's like he's kind of like stumbling over his words, and he's kind of like he's just like a weak guy, if I'm being honest. And Tony Robbins goes, stop. He's like, he literally goes, holy shit. He goes, get out here. And he pulls the guy out of the crowd, and he basically goes through this process to show that deep down, men have this desire to have this masculine energy, and women have this desire to have this feminine energy. And I say man and woman, like I'm talking about, like, obviously I believe gay people are born a lot of the times with either a masculine or feminine energy that doesn't match necessarily what the like a guy being masculine. Guys can absolutely be born more feminine. So when I say man or woman, it's masculine, feminine. That's just for the people listening. But he, in our core, that's there. And if you can tap into that and really get that polarization in your relationship, you're going to find passion, because that's where it comes from.
Esther Perel talks about finding the power in difference, right? And so another way, that's a cool way to think about it. And another way is, because what went through my mind when you described that guy who's just like kind of moping is he's probably not having a very secure relationship with himself. And so it's very, just down. And I work a lot of times in couples to help people develop their own sexual self, develop their own, because it is an integral part of us. And so if they are denying that part, there's a part of themselves that's being denied. And so there's actually a lot of work that needs to be done on an individual level for a lot of people in order to be able to participate in a partnered experience.
So if you find yourself in a situation like that guy, like what are some things immediately that you help your clients do to get out of that spot?
So in every sexual situation, there are things that can slam on the brakes and things that can slam on the accelerators. And a lot of times the people with lower desire, or people who are just more, they're holding back, they've usually got a ton of brakes going on. So we try to figure out what's going on there. It could be relationship issues. It could be no sex education, or not, inaccurate sex education. It could be performance anxiety. It could be anything. And so we got to figure out like what's getting in the way, so we can relieve some of the brakes and start putting on some accelerators.
No, I think that's really good. Well, speaking of which, you have a YouTube series that's really good about 10 top myths around sexuality. Walk us through a few of the top myths that you hear and what their reality is.
Where to start? I guess a really good myth, since we've been talking so much about the stereotype, is that it is not always men who have the higher libido in partners, in a partnership. And so that can actually be really damaging to, that myth is very damaging to those.
The myth that men have the higher libido. Yeah.
That men have so for people who maybe the woman in a relationship has a higher libido, and the male is just really more like, I'm good with not that much contact. They can both think something's wrong with them when they actually might be perfectly healthy. They still might need help bridging, but there's nothing wrong. It's not a problem. It doesn't have to be called a problem type of thing. Yeah,
I think that's an important one. What are some other common myths that you see around sexuality?
The other is that all women should be able to have an orgasm via penis vagina intercourse. The vast majority, some of the statistics say up to 85-90%, do not orgasm that way and require 15 to 20 minutes of direct clitoral stimulation in order to orgasm. Some need both. And so every body is different. And so that's why it's so important for a woman to know her capacity for pleasure, so she can teach who she's with.
Well, and that's part of like maybe somebody who's and they're like, I just don't enjoy sex very much. Well, they maybe just haven't learned about their own selves enough to learn what they do like or don't like. Is that?
pleasure is a massive component that that I think doesn't get focused on quite a bit, doesn't get focused on enough at all.
Yeah.
And that's something that's completely missing from sex education, right? Is that sex is actually for pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think
usually why people
it's funny because
it.
I think there's only like two animals. I think it's humans. I don't know what the other one is that have sex for fun or pleasure, right? But it really is. I mean, if that's one of the key elements, if it's not, then of course you're not going to want to keep doing that.
Absolutely.
So a couple of the issues that were, again, that people messaged me about that are a little bit tougher issues, but I wanted to get your opinion on. And by the way, pornography, I had several questions about pornography messaged to me. I think it's starting to come out of this negative, dark, shameful place a little bit more. And I think it's a very healthy thing because anything that festers in darkness becomes very negative. I have friends that, just even myself in like my 20s, I remember like, as a guy that's not having sex, I waited till I was 31 years old. Like I was doing the thing. I was like straight up, like I'll have one partner, and I remember like, obviously, I never had an addiction, I would say, or a problem, but I did, something stimulates you, you go look at pornography. Like and you have so much shame behind it. And it's almost becomes like this ritual. Like I think I don't know if this is just a Utah thing or because now that I've like kind of step outside of it and I see it much differently, pornography is no problem. It's not a problem in my life. There's no issue there. It's like if it were to happen to like I stumble upon something, I look at it, it's done, it happens, and it's like I don't beat myself up. It was just a thing. It was like, okay, cool, and now I'm on with my day. It's not, and it's like so rare that it would even be a part of it. It's almost like, but I think in Utah we've got so much shame and culture. Like you're taught from when you're a tiny kid that how bad and damaging porn is and all these things. And so when you do it or when you look at it or you stumble upon it, which every kid does, you just have this like, oh my gosh, I'm terrible. I'm this bad person. I did this horrible thing. And it's funny. It's like, I think my buddy that I was having breakfast with today, he's like, ask her this. He's like, is Utah the only place where like people look at porn, they get off, and then immediately they're like, ew, porn's gross?
No, there are a few other spots, but we are definitely the hub.
You know what I'm saying though? It's like, we've made it such a ritual that it's such this like negative thing. Yes. That I have a buddy, he's one of my close friends, but this guy is like, I love him to death. He's literally the best human I know. And he beats himself up on a daily basis because of this pornography addiction. But he's into his 30s trying to like do the thing, not
religiously.
Not have sex or do anything sexually. He still believes that having sex would be the second worst thing you can do next to killing somebody. Which is a very shameful, thing to think. I used to think that. This is how I know. I'm speaking from my own experience. But like, and so of course we have a physiological need in our body though at the same time. So he goes through this cycle almost daily of like feeling like he's not enough or he's screwed up. He's not good enough. He's not worthy enough of these blessings that like the dude is amazing. Like, and he has no idea just how great he is because he lives with this shame cycle. So I guess my question is like somebody like that, or like if that's you or somebody that you know that's dealing with this pornography issue, how do you help somebody understand like their own sexuality better so that they don't put this emphasis on porn and put it almost on this like this forbidden fruit, right? So that they don't even have to worry about it in their life.
That is a massive topic, and it's very relevant for Utah, like you're saying. One of my biggest beefs, I think, with Utah culture, and a lot of times it is politics. I mean, we're the first to like name it a public health crisis or whatnot, right?
Yeah, that was the stupidest thing I've ever seen.
But I mean, what our crisis is, it's a crisis of media literacy, right? We don't teach kids or adults to know how to decipher between real and not real, and what to do if you happen across certain things, blah, blah, blah. So that's like a generalized beef that I have. But outside of that, it's really important to explore with anyone who comes to me saying I'm having an issue with sexually explicit material. It's a problem in my life. We'll explore what it's meaning to them, what role it's playing in their life. So a lot of times if they're single and wanting to not have partnered experiences, that is an avenue that just develops into, it's the safest sex they can have. And so, but I know that there's conflicts there and I'm not minimizing that.
Right. But I think if you can minimize like what pornography is, it gets rid of the addiction. That's the only reason I don't think it's good for anybody to like go look at porn, especially if you're doing it all the time. But at the same time, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world if you stumble upon porn. Like, I know couples that have divorced because she caught her husband looking at porn once. It's like, holy shit. Like, if you can't keep it together, because if you're going to like whatever the addiction is, if he's addicted to something, like, you work through that. That's why you got married, you know, otherwise stay single. And so I think it's like, that's where I say like, okay, well, you know, we have to change the narrative. It's like you said, in Utah, it's literally like illegal, I think, to look at porn now. Like, that's the law in Utah. It's so ridiculous. Dumb. Yeah. But it's like the whole idea of like, I don't like the whole porn kills love thing, because it's a shameful attitude towards something. And people that deal with that just shame themselves. They put themselves. I first experienced, I dated a girl, I don't know, 10 years ago, that she'd had sex in high school. And put yourself in the position of a girl in high school too. She's trying to fit in. She's trying to figure herself out. All of a sudden, she's dating some guy that she has a crush on, and he's raging with hormones, and he pressures her a little bit more than she's used to. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. Next thing you know, they have sex, or they whatever, you know, like have a sexual experience. And she feels like, oh my gosh, like I've lost all my worth. I've lost all my, you know, valor or whatever. And I think that's so damaging, because I've seen those situations, and those girls do one of two things. They either have to minimize the sexual experience, so they become very promiscuous, or they kind of go into this shameful hiding spot of like, and then they like put up walls and barriers around sexuality in general. I don't want to feel this guilt again. So how does one get rid of that guilt associated with all that?
First, just identifying that is what's going on, that we've attached shame to sexual history, right? Like our worthiness to be loved, to belong, to be wanted, to live a full, vibrant life, to our sexual history, like I say. And that goes for young. I've worked with some people in their 30s who they have never had a partner to sexual experience, and they have a lot of shame around that, because everyone else around them is so much more experienced. And so that, I mean, it can be that down to maybe the stereotype of, you know, shame that something had happened that they, you know, had regretted, but anyway. And so now they're not of the worthy template to have a...
Yeah, they're no longer worthy of that partner they want, future. Right? Like,
right.
It's so damaging. It's and it's so wrong. It's just not right. It's just not accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend. She was a model, and she's married now, has 3 kids. And I remember she told me one time she broke down crying. She was dating a guy at BYU, and he was on the football team. And when he found out she wasn't a virgin, he broke up with her. He said, "I won't date a girl that's not a virgin." And it, to this day, I think affects her. Absolutely. And so, and unfortunately, that guy had that view. Like, where the hell did he get that from? That's the shaming culture that I'm trying to help eliminate a little bit. Because obviously there's a time and place you don't want, you know, of course you're probably in a better position to stay out of life-changing issues if you don't have sex at a young age, right? But at the same time, your life is not less or ruined. It's like, I think there's some bad analogies that are kind of going away. Elizabeth Smart talks about this, where, you know, the licked cupcake,
chewed piece of gum.
I don't think those are as like, I don't hear those anymore, but that was like, I remember I got that lesson growing up.
Yep.
The licked cupcake. I'll never forget it. I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem right. Like, you know.
Okay.
And so I guess it's like just helping more and more to push that narrative around that. Yep. So how does one, if they're in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even whatever, and they're feeling guilt still, maybe they're single again. This is a specific question I had in my messages. Single now, but like grew up with that culture and feels like she just has guilt anytime she tries to get sexual with a man. How do you help get through that or out of that cycle that she's in?
Well, I don't know if this is like cheesy or whatever, but I think getting familiar with the wording or how you are going to communicate your sexual desires and needs. And so sometimes that can be sending this is going to sound silly, but for some people who have very difficult with like verbal, you know, they're looking at the person and feeling like they're gonna be rejected if they say, you know, you can text at times like, this is something that I've, you know, been through and this is where I'm cool with, you know, or just developing your own style of communication, you know, like in the moment type of thing. That often has not happened, especially for a lot of people that are living an Orthodox life. They've never learned the communication style of their choosing, or even how to say, I'm not cool with that, but how about this? like just consent, right? And so that's a lot of what I think a lot of people who transition either outside of religious orthodoxy or become more nuanced and want to be their own like authority on themselves, like they need to like practice ways of communicating what is okay with them and what's not.
Gotcha. No, that's a great answer. Well, a couple other things. So we talked about getting creative in the relationship. Somebody asked me this. It's a question that I have wondered before, but do you use ever like pornography to help couples stimulate exoticness or anything into their relationship?
That is an option that a lot of couples opt to use, you know, so a lot of times my job is just to put out, like, here's the latest research, what sounds good to you, what's within your values, like your own values, and what's not, especially with women who have like, or anorgasmia, like never orgasmed before, you know, the number one recommendation is self-education to figure out what how to orgasm, her favorite ways to orgasm so that she can share that with a partner.
So like practice on herself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And along with that is possibly some erotica or sexually explicit material. And then there are a lot of couples that incorporate it into their sexual repertoire, but it's. Is
it usually helpful or is it usually damaging?
It depends. It totally depends because it's kind of how you think about it too.
That's a good.
And it's also, I mean, there are some issues with some types of pornography, right? That is.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing is like pornography is not all one thing, mm-hmm. right? There's like. It's like steroids. You just like, oh, he uses steroids. Well, there's 100 types of steroids. Like, there's things I think, because like I'm just trying to help like the couple that like the spouse feels like the wife, for example, feels like her husband cheated on her, or feels like she's not enough because the husband used or was looking at pornography. Like, this might not have anything to do with you. There's so much more going on here, and if you can take the personalization of it out and realize, then you can probably help him get to a spot where he no longer feels the need to turn to pornography as well. And I think that is the important message I try to get across to people is like, hey, find out what is he going, what is the pornography? Why does he go to it? Like, talk about it, really dive into it and understand that it's not personal. He's probably not doing that because he wants to make you feel better or because you're not enough. And
in addition to that, I think the fact that she discovered it, is that what you said?
Yeah, a lot of times, like the wife finds out, you know, that the husband...
I mean, there's a real rich relationship dynamic to dive into right there, right? So the secrecy...
Let's do that for a second. Because I think that's an important one for relationships.
Out of all the couples that I've worked with that had this come up where it was discovered or whatnot, that there was some sort of violation of the sexual agreement that was actually never agreed upon, but they just... assumed. Yeah. Right. And so I've never had one say that the secrecy wasn't the worst. The secrecy was how did worse. I word that? The secrecy was the worst part.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The fact that we didn't talk about it.
Yeah. And the fact that I had to discover it and those types of things. I mean, and so it's so important. It's the communication piece within relationships. And a lot of times it's just easier. I'm not going to minimize, but a lot of times it's easier to go to a screen than have a hard conversation with your spouse or the vulnerability of a spouse and those types of things. And so getting better at communicating about desires, needs, stress levels, vulnerability, like need for closeness, like all the things that can make a really rich relationship. If you're not working on those skills, it is so much easier to dive into engaging in things that are more on the secrecy side of things.
I think that's very well said. I think in general, it keeps coming back to communication, right? I even think like sex has to be understood. You should never use manipulation or anything like that to try to just not be selfish with it, right? Because if you're doing those things, obviously there's going to be pain to somebody else, wherever that is. I also think that you don't have to, I just want to get rid of some of these stigmas that are like sex is the next worst thing you can do next to killing somebody. And
that needs to go.
What are the couple of the other messages that are really damning that you hear working a lot with, in this community?
Well, there's the double bind for women of you don't want to be one of those girls that is actually sexually knowledgeable and knows herself and those types. They're labeled as one of those girls, right? But on the flip side, uneducated, not sexual, like there's just a real like no win there, that type of like Madonna whore complex type of thing.
Well, one thing my relationship coach told me, she said if if you're, with a woman and she's opening up sexually, and it's important to let her know, like, hey, I think it's really sexy when you do this, because she feels slutty otherwise, because the society tells her that's slutty. So when you tell her, like, if you feel like your wife or husband, whoever, isn't like putting enough effort into, like, maybe trying new things or experimenting or being sexier in, when you're having sex, because there is like a sexiness to it, right? Talk to them and let them know, like, hey, when you did that, I thought that was really sexy. Or like, gosh, you were so sexy when you did this, or this was really, I really enjoyed this when you were doing this, because it allows them to go, oh, I don't have to feel like a slut. Yeah, because we're so wired by society. This is like in general, I think we're so wired by society to, like, if a girl's willing to do that, she's a slut, right? Or like, oh man, if a girl doesn't, if a guy does that, he's like a pervert, Or
my flip side to that I hear a lot of is, where did he learn that? It must have been in porn, right? And so when it may or may not have been, right? But he just wants to try something new that he heard about, with his wife. So
yeah, I think that was one of the best messages that I ever got from her, was, like, to really be able to communicate in the moment so that they can feel comfortable with you and all those different things. Awesome. Well, another question I had from my audience is, how is social media affecting married couples and their sexual relationship?
I think the first thing that just came into my mind is just how much there is to distract us in general. And social media is just like the vortex of just, sucking us all in. And so I think, like anything, there needs to be a balance, and everybody's different. But it definitely is, I think, problematic in the way that it's so much easier to just distract into social media or whatever is so, at their fingertips, versus, engaging and having vulnerable conversations, or, and you know what, to cut some people some slack, like if they're in the baby or young kid years of marriage, that is statistically one of the hardest, or that's libido drops a lot of times, or amount of sexual contact drops. I mean, it's just understandable, right? Everyone's running around, and the woman has oftentimes, the kid's hands all over her all day, and the last thing she wants is more hands on. And so, like, that's a very, phase of life is something to consider as well.
And so if somebody's just not happy in their sex life, they want to get help, how does a lot of people are going to be embarrassed to reach out to a sex therapist. I know I was like, when I reached out to a relationship coach, I felt it was like I was so secret about it at first, but I just wanted to know how to be better at the whole thing, like how to just be a better man in the moment and everything else, like just how to show up the right way for a woman and how to make sure she's comfortable and just be a good guy about it. And so but it was like, I remember I had so much, I was just like, I ain't telling anybody about this. Now I'm more open, obviously, about it all, because I know that my story will help other people. And I have no shame no longer associated to sexuality, and so it is crazy how much different you feel when you have a healthy view of that. So somebody that maybe, whether they're single and that, let's say they just want to get, healthy again with sexuality, they're married and they just want their, marriage to have more better sex in it. What's the first step to reaching out to somebody like you, and how do they bring up the conversation with the spouse?
I'll answer the first one. There is a great website it's asect.org. It's AASECT.org. And there you can click on therapists or counselors, and you can find anyone in your own area. So they have the same training that I have. And a lot are starting to offer teletherapy. Or telecounseling. So that's pretty convenient nowadays. And then just bringing it up with a partner.
Yeah, like if somebody's listening, they're like, okay, I get that I need to communicate this now, but like I'm just embarrassed about it. I don't want to do it. This is awkward. Those are going to be real thoughts that people are having, right? So how do you help them get over that stigma or that just that fear of actually bringing it up?
My honest opinion is that we need to stop framing so many of these things as a problem, right? Because I mean,
well, that's when my friends, when they say that, like, oh, I made a mistake.
Yeah.
Like, did you though? Like, hold on, the words we use matter, right?
Yeah,
so absolutely. I think that's very important.
And so, along those lines, saying, spouse, like we would go to a financial counselor, wouldn't we, or advisor? We would go to classes to improve our cooking. Like couples do that all the time. What is wrong with going to a sexuality coach or therapist? Like there does not have to be any something different about that. Right. And so it can even be, I am having a hard time talking about this, and I would like someone else there to coach me to talk about my own needs and desires. Will you please come with me? Like those types of things can be, those are two rapid fire ways.
Yeah. And if you know me, just passively aggressive, like, hey, we should start listening to Jimmy's podcast and just put it on in the car or something.
Just like, oh, this girl. Oh, okay. What was that website?
What's this one? Kristin Bennion. Oh, this one looks fun.
Oh, okay. Sweet.
Well, you're awesome. Do you take on more clients right now? If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Sure. You can go to my practice website is intimateconnectionscounseling.com. Okay. It's kind of long. Or you can find me on Instagram. It's Kristin Marie Bennion.
Kristin Marie Bennion. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. I recommend, dead serious. Like, I wanted this episode to be on my podcast. Obviously, I'm being a little bit vulnerable with some things, but it's just made a big difference in my life. And I encourage anybody that's listening that if you feel like, hey, you know what, I do have some unhealthy views about sexuality, and it takes time. It took me a couple of years to unwire some of these thoughts that I was living with that were causing me this pain or whatever else, or this shame and different things. And I think that once you get a healthier view of sexuality in general, it no longer becomes like an obsession in your mind either. It's just like a cool part of life. You're not like always thinking about it 24/7, which a lot of guys in their 20s are. So, well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Thanks. This was really fun.